Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are tackling a period that I think a lot of people feel they know, but the reality is just so much more complex. We're talking about medieval England.
Mm. There's this popular image of it being, just mud and chaos,
Mm,
sort of legal dark age.
exactly. But when you actually get into the sources we're looking at today, and we have everything from Anglo-Saxon law codes to these, well, incredibly detailed treatises on how to manage an estate, we're charting the world before the common law we know today really solidifies. It's a world where justice is this patchwork of local custom, community pressure, and sometimes, well, the literal judgment of God.
It's a crucial distinction to make, isn't it? The law wasn't primitive, it was just different. Its logic was rooted in a different kind of society.
Okay, so let's lay out the plan. We want to uncover the foundational principles of justice, social hierarchy, and get into the really granular details of daily life. I want to show that medieval people had their own version of hyper-specific contracts long before we had teams of lawyers.
Precisely. And we'll start by defining that Anglo-Saxon world,
Yeah.
where your social status dictated pretty much everything. Then we'll get into the dramatic methods of proof.
You mean the ordeal?
The ordeal, exactly.
Yeah.
And how that whole system just collapsed after a kind of theological revolt in 1215, which then paved the way for the jury.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. We're going to spend a good amount of time on a document called the Rectitudines Singularum Personarum.
Which is just gold.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the master key to understanding medieval employment contracts and property rights. It's dense, but it's where the real detail is.
After that, we have to look at the friction points, the endemic corruption in the system.
Yeah, and how figures like Robin Hood become these sort of popular political statements against that very corruption, and of course, the completely arbitrary power of the King's Forest Law,
And we'll wrap it all up by looking at the long tail of history, some truly absurd, yet technically still existing archaic offenses in modern UK law.
which really proved that this medieval habit of being incredibly specific in legal thinking, well, it never fully vanished.
Fantastic. So let's begin by grounding ourselves in that social hierarchy. Let's go back to the Anglo-Saxon period.
To get your head around the law in the pre-conquest world, you have to first understand that status wasn't fluid like we think of it today. It was rigid. Your social tier defined pretty much everything about your legal existence.
Your rights, your responsibilities, even how much a fine was if you broke a law.
All of it. And at the top of that local structure, you had the thanes.
The local lords, essentially. And our sources are very clear on this. They were the power brokers. They held this immense localized authority.
And their primary job, their main function, was military. They were expected to provide protection from invaders, like the Vikings, for instance.
And in return for that protection, they commanded absolute loyalty from the common people, the ceorls.
Right. And that command wasn't just a theoretical idea of loyalty. It was legally enforceable. The Fander system wasn't just about owning a big chunk of land.
No, it conferred this deep social control. I was struck by the source material that shows a thane could actually force an unwelcome person to leave the village.
Yes, if someone was a threat or just didn't fit in, the Thane had the power to expel them. That level of personal, localized authority over who belongs and who doesn't is so characteristic of Anglo-Saxon society.
Okay, so below the thanes, you have the vast majority of the population, the ceorls.
The common people, the peasants, they were generally poor, living in these small, often single-room huts. Their lives revolved around subsistence, agriculture, or maybe a trade.
Things the community needed, like weaving, metalworking, carpentry.
Exactly. And their relationship with the Thane was the essential legal contract of the time. It was all about reciprocal duty.
So the ceorls owed military service. They had to fight in the local militia, the feared, when the thane called on them.
And in return for that, the Thane offered protection, not just from Viking raids, but from internal chaos too. If a ceorl failed in his duty, well, that protection just evaporated. He could lose his land, face severe penalties.
So the law wasn't really written down in a contract you'd sign. It was embodied in this relationship of service and reciprocation. It feels so much more personal than modern law.
Absolutely. The law was the relationship. But if we go even further down the hierarchy, we find the slaves.
And this group, I mean, they were profoundly dehumanized by the system. They were the absolute bottom, forced to work their entire lives for their owner.
Their status was marked visually, too, which just reinforced that social chasm. They were these cheap, dull wool clothes, deliberately designed to make them stand out as different.
And the sources are pretty grim about their living conditions. It says they often slept in the cowshed or the barn.
sharing space with the animals. It speaks volumes about their complete lack of social status, of basic human comfort.
But the pathways into and out of slavery, they reveal a lot about the desperate economic realities of the time.
They do. It suggests a surprising, if brutal, kind of legal fluidity. Obviously, being born a slave was the main way, but war was a constant source. The material notes many conquered Celtic Britons, for instance, were enslaved after a conflict.
But the one that's really heartbreaking is just sheer economic desperation. You could be forced into slavery if you couldn't pay a fine.
Or even worse, during a famine, a family facing starvation might sell a child into slavery.
Which sounds monstrous to us, but you have to see it from their perspective. It wasn't necessarily malicious. It was this desperate hope that the child would at least be fed on the Thane's estate.
It just underscores how close to the margin of survival most of society lived.
But the law did provide routes out. Manumission was possible.
It was. Relatives could ransom a slave if they could somehow scrape together enough wealth. Or freedom might be granted in an owner's will, often as a pious act to help their soul in the afterlife.
The most legally interesting one, I think, is the connection between debt and freedom.
Yes, if you became a slave because you couldn't pay a debt, the law recognized this concept of labor as repayment.
So once the estimated value of all your labor equaled what you originally owed, you had a legal right to be freed.
That's right. It shows that even for this lowest status, there was this economic metric for freedom. Your liberty was tied directly to a financial calculation.
Okay, so moving from the status of people to the early attempts to codify all these rules, this brings us to the laws of Ain from Wessex.
Which date all the way back to the late 7th century. And they're so crucial because they show this early, organized attempt to structure all these economic duties and obligations.
Let's pick out one specific mechanism from them, the barley rent. The laws of Ain required laborers to pay 6 ways of barley. What does that tell us?
Well, two things. First, that the legal system was completely intertwined with the agricultural calendar and its output. And second, that these payments weren't just, casual rent for the land.
No, it was a specific, legally mandated obligation. It was codified in the king's law.
It wasn't a casual agreement at all. And those same laws prescribed very strict penalties for property, crimes, theft, damage, trespassing. The focus was always on compensation. Restoration was just as important as punishment.
So in the middle of this very structured, often brutal society, what was the status of women? The laws of Imatan do recognize certain women's rights.
They do. They acknowledge a woman's right to inherit property, which is pretty notable for the era. And they could act as legal witnesses.
But there's a big catch, isn't there?
A huge catch. A woman's testimony in court was only considered legally valid if it was supported by a male witness. So while she had a voice, that voice needed, well, validation from a man to have any real weight. It just reinforces the male subordination of the time.
Okay, let's shift to laws about managing the community itself, specifically how they handled movement and safety. The Anglo-Saxon system had these enshrined guest rights.
And this has a remarkable parallel to the ancient Greek idea of xenia. It's so important. When a traveler came through a district, they didn't have any local kin.
And your kin, your family, that was your legal standing.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So local men of authority, a bishop or an earl, would legally assume the position of the traveler's kin. They took responsibility for the guest, for their safety, basically substituting the community structure that the traveler was missing.
It's an ingenious legal fix for the problem of travel. Today, you have an ID, a passport. Back then, your worth was your relationships. If you didn't have any, the Thane legally supplied them for you.
And this leads to my favorite, most charmingly practical law that regulated movement. It comes from the law codes of King Wichred of Kent around AD 695.
The horn.
The horn. The codes mandated that if you were leaving the public highway, you had to blow a horn or call out.
Why such a specific rule?
Because if you didn't, you were presumed to be a wrongdoer. A thief, a bandit, someone trying to sneak around for illicit purposes. The law demanded transparency of movement.
So if you cut through a field in silence, you were automatically suspicious.
Deeply suspicious. And the sources say people were actually glad of the sound of the horn. It was a signal of legitimate movement, of peace. It confirmed who belonged and who was just passing through honestly.
The horn was your legal signal of legitimacy. That's fantastic. You signal your good intentions or you face the consequences. And speaking of consequences, let's move from the rules to what happened when you broke them.
Right. So our understanding of justice from this period comes from a whole range of documents.
Hmm.
You've got the laws from kings like Ethelbert and Canute, customary compilations, royal charters.
And later on, post-conquest, things like the Doomsday Book, which accidentally recorded a lot of existing customs.
Exactly. But all these sources show that the day-to-day legal business wasn't happening in some big central court. It was handled locally in the hundred court and the county court.
These were literally the courts of the people, weren't they? Where local landowners and freemen would gather.
They were. And what they focused on tells you everything about their priorities. It was almost exclusively homicide, mayhem, that serious physical injury, and larceny.
And we have to emphasize how big a deal cattle stealing was.
Oh, it was huge. Cattle were walking capital. They were your savings, your tractor, your food source, all in one. Stealing them was an attack on the very economic foundation of the community, and the punishments were incredibly severe.
So, compared to modern courts, things like commercial disputes were pretty minimal.
Almost non-existent. The focus was on violence and property, but just administering this justice was full of challenges. For one, simply compelling the accused to show up to court.
The whole system was so under-resourced, the sheriffs and bailiffs, they just didn't have the kind of state power we rely on today.
And this was made so much worse by the power dynamics. A powerful lord would frequently just protect an offender in his service. He'd basically grant them temporary immunity from the local court because he was stronger than the court.
So what could the court do if an accused person, protected by their lord, just refused to appear?
The remedies were pretty basic. They could try to seize the offender's goods, usually their cattle.
And if that didn't work?
If that failed, they used the ultimate sanction. The offender was declared an outlaw.
And being declared an outlaw meant you were stripped of all legal protection.
Completely. You were outside the law.
Well,
Anyone could injure you or even kill you without any penalty. A royal expedition to go after a protected offender was incredibly rare, reserved for open treason. Being in law was what made you a citizen. To be outlawed was to lose everything.
that concept is just so intense. But okay, let's say a suspect did appear in court. How on earth did they determine guilt, especially without modern forensics?
Well, that's where we get to the dramatic, dangerous, and deeply religious practice known as the ordeal,
The judgment of God.
the judgment of God. The procedure would start with the accused taking an oath of innocence. But, given the lack of evidence, a judge was rarely going to rely on just that.
And that's when they brought out the spectacle. And there were different types of ordeal, weren't there? Trial by hot iron, boiling water, cold water.
And it wasn't a random assignment. The type of ordeal you faced was often determined by your social status, your criminal history, even your ethnicity. A cleric would get different, usually less severe treatment than a common peasant.
And the priest was central to this whole process.
Absolutely essential. A priest supervised the whole thing, administering the religious rites that gave the outcome its legitimacy as a divine inquiry.
So walk us through one. Let's say trial by hot iron. What actually happened?
The accused would have to hold a piece of red-hot iron, maybe weighing a pound, and carry it for a set distance, say 9 feet.
Ooh.
Then the hand was immediately bandaged and sealed by the priest, and then they'd wait. After 3 days, the bandages were removed in a formal ceremony. If the wound was clean, if it was healing, it was a sign from God that the person was innocent.
And if not?
If the wound was infected, festering, well, that was God declaring them guilty. The core belief was that the divine would literally interfere with the laws of nature to protect an innocent person.
It's this bizarre mix of pragmatism and, well, terror. But even in the high medieval period, people were starting to question this. This brings us to that crucial theological critique.
Yes, from influential thinkers like Peter the Chanter. He argued very forcefully that the ordeal did not provide proof as clear as the light of day.
He called it a tempting of God.
He did. He said you were essentially demanding a miracle from God to settle a mundane criminal case. And that intellectual resistance from within the church was the beginning of the end. If the spiritual authorities themselves started to doubt it, the whole legal legitimacy just crumbled.
And the final nail in the coffin came in a very specific year, 1215.
The Fourth Lateran Council. The church formally withdrew its support. It forbade priests from supervising the ordeal. And without that religious seal of approval, the ordeal couldn't function as a legal tool anymore.
So what's truly remarkable is how quickly England adapted to this crisis of proof.
It is. The transition was made so much easier by a legal mechanism they already had in place, the jury of presentment.
This was the ancestor of the modern grand jury.
That's right. This jury already existed. Their job was to determine if someone suspected of a crime should even be brought forward for a trial, a trial by ordeal.
So they just had to pivot its function.
Exactly. Instead of deciding if someone should go to the hot iron, they were now asked to determine the final verdict based on testimony and their own local knowledge. It was a relatively smooth institutional shift that let England adopt the jury system very quickly, unlike a lot of continental systems that went down the path of confession and Roman law.
So the jury was kind of waiting in the wings all along, but its rise didn't immediately create a perfectly fair system. There were still all sorts of complexities in the post-conquest legal procedures.
Not at all. Confession was still widely used, and the sources say England was no stranger to torture, particularly the peine forte et dure,
Pressing with weights.
which was sometimes used to force a defendant to consent to a jury trial. Without that consent, legally, they couldn't proceed.
And then you had the constant interference from the church through the benefit of clergy.
Right. If you were accused of a crime and you could read the first verse of the 51st Psalm, the so-called neck verse, you could claim this benefit. Church officials could then claim you for trial in their own courts.
Which almost never used the death penalty.
Right. So it essentially became a loophole for the educated class, a clear privilege of status.
And finally, let's look at that specific case that set a key precedent for sanctuary limits. The story of Isabel.
This is a perfect example of case law being made on the fly. Isabel commits a felony inside a church, a designated sanctuary, and then claims the protection of that same sanctuary.
So the question was, does sanctuary protect you from a crime you committed in the sanctuary?
And the authorities were genuinely uncertain. But the decision, which they made after consulting with the bishop's people, was a resounding no. They ruled that sanctuary protection did not apply if the crime happened inside the church itself.
It was a pragmatic response to a slippery slope fear, wasn't it?
Totally. They were afraid that if they upheld her claim, criminals would just start committing crimes inside churches to get immediate protection. Isabel was eventually convicted after trying to stall by refusing a jury trial, which was a common tactic.
It's just remarkable how medieval society ran on these customs that had to be constantly tested and refined by specific crises. Okay, let's shift from crime and punishment to the very foundation of their economy, the social contract of labor.
If you really want to understand the economic DNA of this period, you have to look at one document in particular. It's granular, it's detailed, and it's absolutely crucial. The Rectitudines Singularum Personarum.
The rights and duties of various persons. And this text is pivotal because it wasn't originally written as a rigid law code, was it?
No, not at all. It started life as a model treatise, a kind of management guide for estate owners. It detailed all the accepted duties and customs for different kinds of landholders. But its function changed dramatically after the Norman Conquest in 1066.
The context of when it was compiled is really important here. It emerged during a time of huge social and agricultural change. Estates were consolidating, breaking apart. It created a lot of anxiety.
A huge amount of anxiety and a real need to formalize tenants' rights before they were just eroded away.
And after the conquest, its purpose became, well, almost political, defensive.
It did. The new Norman lords were bringing in new labor demands, foreign customs. So Anglo-Saxon legal scholars, especially the compiler we know only as Q, they included the Rectitudines in their big legal collections.
And this was a deliberate legal move.
A very deliberate act. It was about protecting the ancient rights and the legal identity of Anglo-Saxon tenants against these new Norman practices. They were essentially taking old custom and turning it into a legal weapon to defend the conquered population.
So let's break down the definitions of labor status in the Rectitudines. At the heart of the laboring class was the Gebur.
The contract worker, the absolute backbone of the estate. The Gigur was bound to cultivate the lord's inland, or domain the land the lord held directly. And his labor schedule was, well, intense.
They owed something called week work. 2 days a week, normally.
Normally. But that ramped up significantly during the crucial agricultural seasons. During the harvest, it was 3 days a week.
And for the spring plowing, too. From February 2nd right up to Easter, 3 full days of work a week.
And on top of that, there were specific plowing duties detailed down to the acre. For instance, he often had to plow 1 acre per week from the start of the fall plowing until November 11th. It was just this nonstop, legally defined cycle of duty.
But this incredible labor burden came with equally specific perquisites, the compensation package, if you will, that the Gabor got when he started.
It was essentially a complete starter kit for his family to work the land. He was given 2 oxen, 1 cow, 6 sheep, and crucially 7 acres of land that were already sown.
So he could get a harvest in his first year.
Exactly. He also got essential tools, the tila, and basic house furnishings, the supplies. The Lord provided the entire working unit,
But if the Lord provided everything, that must have come with a huge legal catch.
a massive one. That initial grant, the animals, the tools, it wasn't the Gebur's property to keep. If the Gebur died, the Lord took everything back.
Wow. So it solidified the family's dependence on the estate generation after generation?
It did. He was basically leasing a complete working unit that reverted to the Lord on his death. It made it almost impossible to build any real generational wealth or ownership from that grant.
Now contrast that heavy burden with the Janite, who had a much higher status in the rectitudines.
The Janit's duties were very different. They often involved writing services, acting as messengers or escorts for the Lord. Their agricultural work was minimal, focused more on dues than on daily field labor. They were clearly a higher social and economic rank.
But then the Normans arrive, and this clear Anglo-Saxon distinction between the agricultural Geber and the more mobile Janite, it gets intentionally blurred.
Deliberately diluted into a new single category, the villainous. This new Norman category came to encompass both the former Geburas and many of the Janiatas.
Which for the Janite must have been a significant drop in status.
A huge drop. They often lost their higher standing and, critically, their ability to leave the land freely. They became locked into this more uniform, more dependent tenant class.
So the Normans are using legal classification as a tool of control to homogenize the workforce, which brings us back to the brilliant legal strategy of those Anglo-Saxon scholars, the act of elevating custom to formal law, or imilus.
This is the genius move. When the scholar Q translated the rectitudines into Latin, the language of the new Norman courts, he didn't just translate the descriptions, he strategically added the word ius.
Which means right or law.
Exactly. He turned custom into legally enforceable right.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that would work?
Sure. Take the Hayward, the official in charge of the fences. The custom stated that his compensation should lie next to the pasture. That's a tradition. But by adding aedis to that statement, Q made that ancient privilege universally binding. He elevated it from local tradition to a legal right.
So if a new Norman lord comes in and tries to deny that payment or impose some new demand, the tenant can now point to this official legal text and say, no.
This isn't just what we used to do. This is aedius. This is my legal right, recognized by the law of the land.
That's fascinating. It's a remarkable example of how law becomes a defensive tool, cementing protections for the lower classes who are being squeezed by the new system.
They used the conqueror's language to preserve the conquered's economic privileges.
So on one hand, you have this sophisticated system trying to create order, but as we said earlier, the reality of medieval justice often fell very short of that, which led to widespread corruption. Let's dive into that friction.
We really have to emphasize this. The legal system in medieval England was just riddled with endemic corruption. The entire system was under-resourced. The local officers, constables, bailiffs, and especially the sheriffs were often ill-trained and, frankly, motivated by greed.
Which created this paradox, right? The system was slow and harsh for the poor, but for the powerful, it was surprisingly lax and full of loopholes.
Completely. The wealthy elite could easily afford bail. They could just refuse to appear in local courts. They knew how to delay proceedings for months, even years, long enough to secure a royal pardon, often through a bribe or influence at court.
It was so bad that a specific law was passed in 1330 just to stop jailers from being bribed to let prisoners go.
Justice was, far too often, one system for the rich and a brutal, swift one for the poor.
And this systemic failure, it gives us the perfect context for the popular tales of Robin Hood. These weren't just adventure stories, they were a profound social and political commentary.
They were. And the tales reserved their strongest anger not for the king, but for his local agents. The powerful, wealthy abbots, the greedy sheriffs, the corrupt justices who were abusing the poor under the color of law.
The narrative was always that the local system was completely rotten. The only hope was to appeal directly to the distant and therefore idealized authority of the king.
That distinction is vital. The anger was aimed at the local officials, while loyalty was reserved for the king. And those same sentiments, that local government is corrupt and only the monarch can bring true justice, that's what fueled the peasants' revolt a century later. Robin Hood was the fictional champion for a very real social anger.
Okay, now let's talk about the most hated instrument of royal power, something that existed entirely outside the common law. Forest law.
Forest law was universally seen as arbitrary and fundamentally unfair. The core issue was the king's obsession with the hunt. William the Conqueror famously made it clear he preferred animals to his subjects.
And huge areas of land were declared forest, which didn't necessarily mean it was all woods, right?
Not at all. It just meant it was land reserved for the king's pleasure, for his hunting, and it was removed from the jurisdiction of the common law courts.
And this created a massive legal conflict. Killing a deer in the king's forest was a serious crime, but what kind of crime was it, legally speaking?
This is a fascinating legal nuance. The authorities wrestled with the concept of res nullius, a thing belonging to no one, which is what wild animals technically were under common law. So killing a deer was legally considered trespass against the king's protected area, not theft.
And why did that distinction matter so much?
Because high-value theft often carried the death penalty. Trespass, on the other hand, usually resulted in a severe fine or mutilation, but typically not death. So there was this fundamental tension between the king's desire for absolute, brutal power and the actual structure of property rights in his own law.
And this inherent unfairness led to these extreme acts of defiance, the poachers' protest.
It did. Outlaw fiction just bled into real-life protest in these shocking theatrical ways. We have historical records of poachers performing these deliberate acts of defiance designed to mock the king's authority.
What kind of acts are we talking about?
The most dramatic example is when poachers would kill a stag in the forest, cut off its head, and then stick the head on a pole with a stick wedged in its mouth.
Like a standard.
Exactly, like a battle standard, facing the rising sun. And they did this as a mark of treasonous spite, equating the killing of the king's sacred deer with the public execution of a traitor. It was an overtly political, symbolic act of violent resistance.
Which perfectly mirrors the kind of violence you see in the outlaw stories.
Absolutely. The violence of outlaws like Robin Hood often served as a dark mirror to the cruelty of the official system. In some of the older ballads, Robin meets violence with violence, sometimes involving mutilation.
In the Ballad of Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, he beheads his enemy, Guy, and sticks his head on his bow.
And it explicitly mimics the ritualistic processing of a poached animal as the ultimate insult.
So these outlaws were responding to a system they saw as broken. But the group that was supposed to be maintaining order was, of course, the knightly class.
The class defined as those who fought, heavily armored, using swords, maces, lances, and defined by their mobility and speed on powerful war horses. Their entire social and legal role was based on maintaining power through force.
And their training must have been just relentless.
It was. We know they trained extensively with the quintain. This was a weighted target on a rotating arm. The knight would charge at full speed, strike the target, and if he didn't hit it right, the weighted arm would swing around and smack him. It forced him to learn how to deliver and receive a blow while controlling a galloping horse.
But for all their armor and training, they were hardly invincible.
Far from it. Difficult terrain could completely neutralize a cavalry charge. Coordinated foot soldiers in tight formations could be devastating. And of course, there's the threat of ranged weapons.
The English longbow.
The English longbow was a game changer, capable of firing heavy arrows that could penetrate plate armor at a distance. It was a decisive factor in bringing down the armored knight, and with him, the old balance of military power.
And when they weren't fighting, this elite class had their leisure activities.
A lot of dice, board games like chess, elaborate riddles, horse racing, and of course hunting, which was its own ritualistic display of status.
And this mix of high culture and military reality, it brings us to one of the most incredible stories from the period, the Battle of Hastings Jester.
The story of Taillefer. His name literally means hewer of iron. He was a Norman minstrel, a jongleur in William the Conqueror's army.
And just before the Battle of Hastings began, he rode out between the two armies.
He did. He rode out, juggling his sword, and singing the Chanson de Roland, the great epic poem of Charlemagne's knights. He killed multiple English soldiers, some accounts say 4, and was then finally cut down. But in doing so, he had initiated the Norman charge.
He blurred the line between entertainer, soldier, and legend, a cultural display used to trigger one of the most significant battles in British history. Incredible. Okay, we've covered a lot. Now let's jump forward a few centuries and see how this medieval love of specific rules still haunts the statute books today.
Before we get to the really strange surviving laws, it's worth touching on childhood in the medieval period because a child's early introduction to duty and labor is reflected in the law.
And a child's life was completely dependent on their class. Aristocratic boys were trained for leadership pages, then squires, while girls were often sent to courtly or monastic institutions to learn household management, all in preparation for a strategic marriage.
Whereas children from poorer families were put to work almost as soon as they could walk, collecting firewood, helping with the harvest, herding animals. Their labor was absolutely essential for the family's survival, which established a very early sense of economic duty.
And education was dominated by the church, emphasizing religion, obedience, and very strict discipline.
And their leisure time reflected their status too. Wealthier children had these lovely, finely crafted toys, metal toy knights, tiny soft metal cups and plates, and cloth dolls called puppets.
But poorer children were creative. They made their own toys, boats from bread, spears from sticks. They played games with cherry stones, a rough form of football, archery. The culture of play was definitely there.
Right. Now for the final and most humorous part of our deep dive. The bizarre specific statutes that centuries of lawmaking have left behind, like fossils in the legal code.
Let's start with my absolute favorite, which is still technically on the books from the Licensing Act 1872. It is an offense to be drunk while in charge of a carriage, a horse, a steam engine, or a cow.
A cow. You can be arrested for being drunk in charge of cattle on a public highway.
It sounds like a joke, but the sources confirm this is entirely true and has even been enforced in the last century.
The penalty is serious too. A fine or up to a month in prison, potentially with hard labor. It sounds absurd to us because we don't drive herds of cattle down the M1 anymore, but it comes from an era when that was a common and necessary activity.
Imagine getting pulled over for drunk driving a cow. It just speaks to that incredible specificity the law needed to achieve. Okay, then we have a truly antiquated law that targeted women's speech, the common scold.
This was a common law offense, going way back. It was for women who were prosecuted for publicly scolding. So, nagging, quarreling, disturbing the public peace with their voice. And the punishments were designed for maximum public humiliation.
Well, were they?
The main ones were the ducking chair or the scold's bridle. The ducking chair was a seat on a long pole where the woman would be strapped in and then repeatedly submerged in a river or pond in front of a crowd.
And the scold's bridle?
That was a metal mask, often with a spiked bit that went into the mouth to prevent the woman from speaking. She would then be led through the streets. It was purely about enforcing public silence and obedience from women.
And the really shocking thing is how long this law stayed on the books. It was called obsolete in 1888, but it wasn't formally abolished in the UK until 1967.
1967, along with other oddities like eavesdropping and challenging someone to a fight. The social attitudes in that law took centuries to finally scrub from the legal code.
And finally, a surprisingly modern law that sounds like it comes straight out of the medieval period. The Salmon Act, 1986, makes it illegal to handle a salmon in suspicious circumstances.
Handling a salmon suspiciously. That phrase is just perfect. He could easily be a royal decree against poaching from the 1300s.
And that's exactly the point, isn't it? It sounds ancient, but it's a recent law designed to give police broad powers to prosecute people who are selling poached fish.
It just demonstrates that even today, when the law tries to regulate illicit activity around natural resources, it can fall back on this language of subjective suspicion that echoes those ancient laws, where criminality was based on whether you blew your horn or not. Hashtag Tatro.
So, after all that, what does it all mean? We've gone from the rigid duties of the Gabur all the way up to the bizarre endurance of laws about drunk cows.
What stands out to me is how medieval society was just fundamentally defined by these reciprocal relationships. The Thane protecting the seer, the Lord providing for the Gabor, all of it formalized in custom and law. Community safety and order were everything.
Reinforced by things as specific as blowing a horn on the highway to prove you weren't a thief. We also saw the huge value they placed on property rights and how quickly the whole legal landscape could change due to massive forces.
Like the Norman Conquest, which had just flattened the Anglo-Saxon status system, and the huge theological challenges that destroyed the ordeal, and almost by accident gave us the jury system.
And that deliberate act of adding the word eosis to the rectitudines, it reminds us that law is never static. It's a dynamic weapon, a tool used to fight these constant battles over status and rights.
The legal history of this period is anything but primitive. It's a detailed, sophisticated, and often desperate struggle for order.
And so we'll leave you, as always, with a final provocative thought to explore on your own. Medieval society relied on this concept of lawworthiness, that you were worthy of legal protection based on your community bonds, your oaths, the status of your lord. If that reliance on personal, verifiable community ties define legal worth, then what is the modern equivalent that dictates our legal worth today when most of us are geographically mobile and our relationships are abstracted through complex digital contracts and data streams?
Think about what it means to be worthy of legal protection in an age that's defined by data points rather than by neighborhood oaths. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.